The Sumerian texts reveal the Anunnaki were escaping something bigger. And if you're listening from somewhere quiet tonight, settling in as the world around you fades to stillness, you've found the right place to explore what they were running from. In the climate-controlled vault of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, there sits a clay tablet barely larger than your palm. Its catalogue number, CBS 10673, identifies it as part of the Nippur excavation collection, one of thousands recovered from the ancient Sumerian city between 1889 and 1900. The tablet itself is unremarkable at first glance. Baked clay, reddish-brown, covered in the wedge, shaped impressions of cuneiform script. But this particular tablet does something unusual for a Sumerian administrative record. It lists items being transferred, not sold, not stored, transferred with deliberate haste from one temple precinct to another, and then, according to the text, sealed for departure. The scribe who pressed these marks into wet clay over 4,000 years ago was not recording routine business. The language carries procedural weight, sacred objects, ritual implements, specific tablets containing what the text calls essential instruction, all catalogued with the precision of someone following emergency protocol. And then, in the final lines, something that makes scholars pause. The word used is ki, which in Sumerian administrative context means to depart or to send away, but here it appears with the determinative marker usually reserved for divine subjects. The gods were leaving, and they were taking specific knowledge with them. This tablet is not alone. Scattered across museum collections in Philadelphia, London, Oxford, Baghdad and Berlin are dozens of similar administrative records from the final decades before what Sumerian tradition calls Amaru, the deluge. Taken individually, each tablet documents routine temple inventory. Examined together, they reveal something closer to organised evacuation. Comment where you're listening from tonight, whether you're drifting towards sleep in California or just starting your morning somewhere across the Pacific. This investigation requires witnesses, because what the Sumerian texts actually describe is not a story of gods who decided to wipe humanity away on a whim. It's something stranger and more unsettling. It's documentation of beings with immense power facing something they could not control, something vast enough that even the Anunnaki, the ones who from heaven to earth came, according to the texts themselves, chose strategic retreat over direct confrontation. The traditional narrative is familiar. The Anunnaki grew tired of humanity's noise. They sent a flood. One human family survived. Civilization rebooted. End of story. But that narrative requires ignoring considerable textual evidence that suggests a very different sequence of events. The tablets describe gods abandoning cities before disasters struck. They record divine assembly meetings where decisions were contested, not unanimous. They preserve instructions given by deities who seem to be preparing humanity for their absence, not their wrath. And most tellingly, the tablets record departures, carefully documented, procedurally executed departures, but they never describe returns. The texts speak of gods who ascended or withdrew to their distant dwellings, but those dwellings are never specified with the precision Sumerians typically employed. For a civilization that mapped the heavens with astronomical accuracy, catalogued hundreds of deities with specific domains and genealogies, and maintained administrative records tracking individual sheep and grain containers, this vagueness is conspicuous. It reads less like mythology and more like information deliberately withheld. What if the Sumerian tablets are not religious allegory but archived documentation? What if the scribes who pressed these records into clay were doing exactly what administrative scribes always do, maintaining continuity of information for whoever came after? And what if the reason the Anunnaki's destination remains unclear in these texts is because they themselves did not know where their retreat would lead, only that staying was not survivable. This investigation will proceed methodically. We will examine the archaeological evidence from Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, where temple layers show not gradual development but sudden architectural shifts suggesting crisis response. We will analyse the Sumerian king list's impossible chronology, 8 kings reigning for a combined 241,200 years before the flood, not as primitive exaggeration, but as a timekeeping system reflecting extended emergency governance. We will read the instructions of Shuruppak, the wisdom text composed just before the deluge, and ask what its specific survival advice reveals about conditions the author expected. We will sit with the Atrahasis epic and pass the Divine Assembly's debate. Why did Enki break ranks to warn a human? What did he know about the coming catastrophe that made disobedience worth the cost? We will trace Inanna's descent into the underworld and consider whether this myth might document something else entirely. Reconnaissance, perhaps, checking whether alternate realms remained accessible when the surface world became untenable. And we will examine the genre of Sumerian city laments, ritual texts describing gods performing formal departure ceremonies before abandoning their temple homes, and confront the uncomfortable question of why deities with cosmic power would need to leave rather than simply prevent whatever threatened. The flood, in this reading, becomes secondary, not the cause, but the symptom. The final collapse of whatever environmental, cosmic, or dimensional stability had been deteriorating for the extended reigns the king list documents. The Anunnaki departed not because they caused the disaster, but because they recognised what was coming and understood they could not stop it. Some, like Enki, chose to leave warning and instruction. Others simply left. The tablets they left behind preserve this in fragments. No single text tells the complete story, but the pattern across multiple independent sources points towards something consistent. Beings with extraordinary capabilities, facing an extraordinary threat, making calculated decisions about what knowledge to preserve and who to warn before withdrawing to somewhere else. Somewhere the texts cannot or will not specify. This is not a story of ancient astronauts. It is not a story of extraterrestrial colonizers. It is, if we take the tablets at their word, from the Sumerian perspective, a story of beings who held power within certain domains, discovering those domains, were not absolute. A story of gods learning they were not the highest authority in whatever cosmic hierarchy actually governed reality. And a story of departure, methodical, documented, irreversible departure, preserved in clay, because those who left understood that someone, eventually, would ask what happened. Tonight we ask that question, with the calm patience required for this depth of investigation. With respect for the scribes who pressed these wedges into wet clay 4 millennia ago, maintaining records because maintaining records was their sacred obligation, and with acknowledgement that answers, when they come from evidence this ancient, arrive with ambiguity intact. The Sumerian texts revealed the Anunnaki were escaping something bigger. The question that follows, what that something was, takes us deep into the oldest written records humanity possesses. We begin where they began, at Eridu, the first city, where the temple foundations tell their own story about what drove the gods to leave. Settle in. This investigation unfolds slowly. The tablets demand close attention, and the implications once seen reshape how we understand not just Sumerian mythology, but the very nature of what those myths might actually preserve. The architecture of divine retreat. Before we can understand what the Anunnaki were fleeing, we need to establish who they actually were within Sumerian textual tradition. Not who popular theories claim they were, not who modern reinterpretations suggest, who the Sumerians themselves, in their own language, on their own tablets, said these beings were. The word Anunnaki appears across Mesopotamian literature for over 2,000 years, from early Sumerian compositions to late Babylonian texts. Its etymology combines Anlod, Unna Pri or Descent, and Kiol, literally translated, those of heavenly descent who are on earth. The name itself embeds a cosmological premise. These beings originated elsewhere and occupy terrestrial space secondarily. In the earliest post-Akkadian period texts, dating to around 2300 BCE, the Anunnaki function as a collective council. The Sumerian term Ukin Anunnaki, assembly of the Anunnaki, appears in administrative and religious contexts describing divine decision-making. These were not solitary gods acting on individual whim, but a bureaucratic structure governing through consensus and hierarchy. The tablets record their primary function with consistent terminology. They were Namtar Rami, those who decree fates. This was not metaphorical. Sumerian theology understood fate as an actual substance or force that could be shaped, assigned, and bound through divine authority. The Anunnaki held monopoly over this process for the earthly realm. The organizational structure, as far as texts reveal it, operated through clear hierarchy. At the apex sat the sky god Anaketa Anu in Akkadian sources, whose temple in Uruk marked the administrative centre of cosmic authority. Below An operated what texts called the Ilrabtim, the great gods, a council of 7 senior deities including Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Inanna, Utu, Nanna, and depending on the source text, either Nergal or Marduk in the 7th position. These 7 held executive authority. They convened in formal assembly to address matters requiring collective decision. Beneath this executive council operated a larger body of 50 Anunnaki, sometimes described in texts as the Anunnaki Am-U Eriti, Anunnaki of heaven and earth. These deities held domain over specific aspects of civilization, natural phenomena, and cosmic maintenance. Each major Sumerian city functioned as the earthly estate of a patron deity from this council, with the city's temples serving as that god's literal household and administrative centre. Belonged to Nanna, the moon god, Uruk to An and Inanna, Nippur to Enlil, Eridu to Enki, Lagash to Ningesu. This was not symbolic patronage. Temple archives from these cities record tribute, ritual schedules, and administrative decisions framed as directives from the resident deity transmitted through priestly channels. The texts describe this arrangement with the same practical language used for human governance structures, because from the Sumerian perspective, they were governance structures. The Anunnaki managed earthly affairs through a distributed network of temple complexes, each staffed with priests, administrators, craftspeople, farmers, and labourers who maintained the god's household and executed the god's policies. The city-state system of Sumer was theological before it was political. Human kings derived legitimacy from divine appointment, documented in royal inscriptions as authority granted by specific Anunnaki council members. This system appears fully operational in the earliest written records from Uruk around 3200 BCE. There is no textual evidence of its gradual development. The administrative tablets documenting temple inventories, land surveys, and labour assignments from this period assume the divine patron structure is given. Whoever established this system did so before writing preserved its origins. The Sumerians themselves attributed it to primordial times, to the era they called Udu-Liata, from distant days when the Anunnaki first descended and established their earthly domain. But the system's functionality contained built-in tensions. The Enuma Elish, though a Babylonian composition from around 1200 BC, preserves traditions about earlier cosmic conflicts. The text describes a primordial war between Tiamat, representing chaotic waters, and Marduk, a younger god who rises to supremacy by defeating her. Marduk's victory allows him to reshape the cosmos, splitting Tiamat's corpse to form heaven and earth as separate realms. This creation myth encodes a theological shift, younger generation gods overthrowing elder powers, reorganizing cosmic structure through violence, then distributing domains among the victorious faction. The Anunnaki inherited this reorganized cosmos. They did not create it, they administered it. This distinction matters. Several Sumerian texts, including fragmentary hymns recovered from Nippur and reference an earlier divine generation called the Igigi, described as gods who bore the workload in primordial times. The relationship between Igigi and Anunnaki remains textually unclear, but the Atrahasis epic, composed around 1700 BC from older oral traditions, preserves a narrative suggesting conflict. The Igigi rebelled against their labour obligations. The Anunnaki responded by creating humans to assume the workload instead. Humanity's origin in this account is explicitly functional, a solution to divine labour shortage. This pragmatic framing recurs across creation accounts. The Enki and Ninmah tablet CBS 2168 from the Penn Museum describes the actual process. Enki and the birth goddess Ninmah collaborate to fashion humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god. The text specifies which god, Weela, described as one who possessed intelligence, was sacrificed for this purpose. His blood provided the essential element that mere clay lacked. The text does not frame this as sacred mystery, but as procedural necessity. Divine intelligence transferred through biological material to create a worker species capable of understanding instruction and executing complex tasks. Multiple attempts failed before the viable human form emerged. The tablet records these failures with the clinical detachment of experimental documentation. What emerges from these varied creation accounts is a cosmology where the Anunnaki operate within constraints. They possess capacities humans lack, but they are not omnipotent. They require labour they cannot or will not perform themselves. They convene councils to make decisions, suggesting individual authority is limited. They engage in conflicts with each other, with elder divine generations, with chaotic cosmic forces. They establish administrative systems because their dominion requires active maintenance rather than flowing from inherent cosmic position. This matters profoundly for understanding their departure. If the Anunnaki were absolute cosmic authorities, their abandonment of Sumer becomes inexplicable. But if they were, as texts suggest, powerful administrators operating within a larger cosmic structure they did not fully control, then departure in the face of overwhelming threat becomes not just explicable but logical. Strategic withdrawal, calculated retreat, preservation of core knowledge and personnel while ceding territory rendered untenable. The tablets preserve their perspective, they record their decisions, and those decisions reveal beings who, despite their power, recognize limits to what that power could achieve. The Anunnaki consensus structure, the assembly model requiring collective agreement, meant that when catastrophe approached, response required coordination. The texts describing divine assembly debates before the flood are not dramatic invention. They reflect the actual governance system through which decisions of cosmic magnitude had to be processed. Enlil, according to multiple sources including the Atrahasis epic and the Eridu Genesis, advocated for letting humanity be destroyed by the coming flood. The noise of human civilization disturbed his rest, but texts suggest a deeper rationale. If the threat approaching was environmental collapse on a scale that would devastate earthly infrastructure, human populations represented resource drains the Anunnaki could not maintain through the crisis. Enlil's position, coldly assessed, was pragmatic. Reduce population to sustainable levels, preserve core divine operations, rebuild afterward. Enki dissented. His dissent is preserved across multiple independent textual traditions, Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Babylonian sources, all record his choice to warn the flood hero and provide survival instructions. The consistency across versions suggests this was remembered as significant transgression. Enki violated assembly consensus. The text of the Atrahasis epic preserves his method. Unable to warn the human Atrahasis directly without breaking divine law, Enki addressed the reed wall of the man's house, speaking instructions that Atrahasis inside overheard. A technicality. The god found a loophole and exploited it. Why? The texts offer Enki's stated rationale, humans were his creation, and he felt obligation toward them. But consider the practical calculus. If Enki understood the coming flood as symptom of a larger destabilization that threatened divine operations themselves, preserving human knowledge carriers and labour capacity becomes strategically necessary for post-crisis recovery. Enki was not being sentimental. He was maintaining operational capacity in preparation for disaster management. The Divine Assembly's debate, then, was not theological but practical. How do administrators with limited resources respond to a catastrophic threat they cannot prevent? Do they attempt to preserve existing infrastructure, including human populations, or do they abandon surface operations entirely and retreat to whatever secure locations remain accessible? The texts indicate the assembly divided. Enlil and his faction advocated full withdrawal. Enki's faction pushed for limited preservation. The compromise, warn one family, preserve genetic diversity and knowledge transmission capacity, let the rest perish in the coming disaster, was perhaps the best consensus they could achieve given the constraints they faced. But this compromise assumes the Anunnaki intended to return after the crisis passed. And here, the textual record becomes conspicuously vague. Post-flood narratives describe rebuilding, new dynasties, re-establishment of kingship. But the Anunnaki themselves fade from active presence in the texts. They become more distant, less directly involved, referenced more as cosmic authorities than as resident administrators of specific cities. The intimate patron-deity relationship, documented in early dynastic temple archives, gradually shifts toward the more abstract divine kingship concept of later Mesopotamian theology. The Lament for Ur, composed around 2000 BC after that city's destruction, preserves a ritual genre that may capture what actually occurred. The text describes the goddess Ningal abandoning Ur before disaster struck. She performs formal departure ceremonies. She entreats the Divine Assembly to spare her city. They refuse. She leaves, and then destruction comes. Multiple laments for multiple cities follow identical patterns. Gods departing, cities falling. This genre is conventionally read as metaphorical. The gods did not literally leave. Their protection was simply withdrawn. But the consistency of the pattern and the procedural detail of the departure rituals suggests these texts preserve memory of actual evacuations. Temple archives from Nippur, Uruk and Lagash show dramatic shifts in administrative record keeping around 2000 BCA. The intimate daily documentation of temple households managing divine estates gives way to more abstract royal administration. The gods remain theologically present but operationally absent. Priests maintain rituals, but the rituals themselves shift from service to resident deities toward petition to distant cosmic authorities. This shift appears in the archaeological record as well. Temple architecture changes. Earlier periods show complex residential quarters within sacred precincts, suggesting the temple housed the god's literal physical presence and attendant household. Later temples become primarily ritual spaces, impressive architecturally, but lacking the extensive domestic facilities of earlier structures. The gods stopped living there. If the Anunnaki withdrew during the catastrophe the texts call the flood, and if that withdrawal was meant to be temporary, then the post-flood textual record should document return. It does not. It documents memory, invocation, petition to distant powers, not resumed administrative presence. The system did not reboot to pre-flood operations. It adapted to divine absence. This absence shapes everything that follows. Human kings no longer derive authority from direct divine appointment conveyed through priestly channels. They claim divine descent, divine selection, divine favour, but are increasing removed. The intimacy of the early dynastic period, where kings consulted with resident deities through ritual and received specific policy direction, gives way to a more familiar religious model where humans petition distant gods and interpret omens to discern divine will. The architectural shift from a state to symbol is theological shift from presence to absence. An absence requires explanation. The Anunnaki did not disappear from Sumerian religion, but they receded from direct involvement in human affairs. The tablets record their withdrawal, and the question that launches this investigation becomes urgent. What were they withdrawing from? What threat was sufficient that even beings described as those who decree fates chose retreat over confrontation? To answer that, we must go to where it began, to Eridu, the first city, where the temple foundations themselves preserve evidence of emergency response to deteriorating conditions, where the sacred precinct tells a story the tablets only hint at, where architecture becomes testimony to crisis the gods themselves could not resolve by remaining. Eridu's ruins wait in the Iraqi desert, silent now, but their structure speaks volumes about why the gods closed the archives and left. Eridu, the first city and the first warning. 24 kilometres southwest of the ancient city of Ur, buried beneath centuries of windblown sand, lie the ruins of Tel Abu Shirain. This is Eridu, the city the Sumerians themselves called Nonki, the place of the sweet waters. According to every version of the Sumerian king list, kingship first descended here from heaven. According to their cosmological traditions, this was where civilization began, not metaphorically, literally. The first city, the first temple, the first place where the Anunnaki established permanent earthly presence. The Iraqi Directorate of Antiquities excavated Tel Abu Shirain in multiple campaigns between 1946 and 1949, led by archaeologist Fuad Safar. Later work continued in the 1980s, before regional conflicts made the site inaccessible. What these excavations revealed confirmed Sumerian tradition's claim, while complicating the neat narrative of gradual civilization development. Eridu was not a settlement that slowly grew into a city. Its temple district was planned and constructed with sophisticated architectural knowledge from its earliest levels. The excavations identified 19 distinct architectural layers at the temple site, designated Temple 1 the most recent, down to Temple 6, the earliest. This sequence spans roughly 2,000 years, from approximately 5300 BC in the Ubaid period to around 3000 BC at the start of the early dynastic period. Each layer represents a rebuilding or modification of the temple dedicated to Enki, the god of water, wisdom and, according to the texts, Eridu's founding patron. Temple 6, the earliest level, sits directly on virgin soil. No earlier settlement layer exists below it. The structure itself measures roughly 4 by 5 metres, small by later standards, but its construction already demonstrates sophisticated principles. The building is rectangular, with a central room and small alcoves. More significantly, its orientation aligns to cardinal directions with precision that required deliberate surveying. The walls incorporate buttresses and recesses that serve no obvious structural purpose, but establish a decorative pattern that becomes standard in Mesopotamian sacred architecture for millennia. This is not primitive construction. It is the work of builders who already possess developed architectural tradition. But Temple 6 exists in relative isolation. The settlement surrounding this earliest temple level is minimal, perhaps a few hundred residents at most. This is not a naturally evolved village where communal worship space gradually becomes more elaborate. This is a temple constructed first, around which settlement then accumulated. The pattern suggests imposition from above rather than organic development from below. The successive temple layers, Svi through XV, show rapid expansion. Each rebuilding increases size and complexity. By Temple XV around 4800 BCE, the structure measures approximately 12 by 17 metres, with multiple chambers, an altar platform, and elaborate facade decoration. The settlement has grown correspondingly, but the temple complex remains the dominant feature, occupying the highest ground and largest area. Whoever directed this expansion commanded substantial labour and resources, more than a village of subsistence farmers could easily spare. Temple architecture during this Ubaid expansion phase follows consistent principles. The main sanctuary always faces northeast, toward the sunrise. A central altar platform receives primary ritual focus. Small side chambers likely stored ritual implements and offerings. Importantly, larger rooms at the rear of these temples contain architectural features suggesting residential occupation, sleeping platforms, storage alcoves, cooking installations. The god did not merely receive worship here. The god, or the god's earthly representatives, lived here. Archaeological deposits from these layers reveal the temple's economic role. Thousands of fish bones, primarily from marine species, appear in refuse pits. Eridu sat near the ancient shoreline of the Persian Gulf, and the temple complex clearly controlled fishing operations. Clay tablets from slightly later periods confirm this pattern. Temples as economic centres managing resource extraction, processing, and distribution. The god's household was the community's largest employer and primary distributor of essential goods. But at Temple 7, around 4200 BC, something changes. The architectural continuity that characterized earlier rebuilding suddenly shifts. Temple 7 abandons the traditional orientation and layout. The structure becomes irregular, almost experimental. Multiple construction phases occur within what excavators identified as a single temple level, suggesting false starts or emergency modifications. The quality of construction degrades, walls are thinner, foundations less substantial. Most tellingly, the residential quarters characteristic of earlier temples are absent. This temple no longer houses permanent occupation. Temple VI restores some order, but at reduced scale. The following layers, V through I, show oscillation between attempted restoration of earlier grandeur and pragmatic reduction of scale. By Temple 1, constructed around 3000 BC, at the start of the early dynastic period, the structure has become massive, nearly 60 by 80 metres, but its interior organisation has transformed from residence to ritual theatre. Enormous central space for public ceremony, minimal service quarters, no residential facilities whatsoever. The god has stopped living at Eridu. This architectural transition correlates with environmental data. Sediment analysis from excavation levels indicates rising water tables during the period of Temple 7's irregular construction. The site began experiencing periodic flooding not from the Euphrates River but from rising groundwater. Eridu's location near the Gulf made it vulnerable to sea level changes or shifts in the water table. The sweet water that gave the city its name was becoming a threat, but geological conditions alone do not explain the settlement's ultimate abandonment. Eridu did not flood into oblivion. It gradually declined across the 3rd millennium BC until, by 2000 BC, the site was deserted, except for occasional ritual visits to what had become a ruin. The temple that Sumerians revered as the first place where the Anunnaki descended to earth became a memory, an abandoned monument where later pilgrims left offerings to a past they could not quite understand. The Eridu Genesis tablet, known from fragmentary copies housed in multiple collections, preserves the city's mythological narrative. The text is damaged, but surviving portions describe creation, the establishment of kingship, and a flood sent to destroy humanity. Eridu features prominently as the location where Enki resides when he learns of the coming disaster. The text describes his decision to warn the flood hero, here called Ziusudra, by speaking to the reed wall of the man's house. The parallel to the Atrahasis account is clear. Same deity, same method, same violation of divine assembly consensus. What the Eridu Genesis adds is context. The flood occurs after the uproar of mankind became intolerable, and sleep was no longer possible because of the Babel. This rationale appears across multiple flood accounts, but the Eridu version places special emphasis on the location. Eridu, the first city, had become the site of intolerable conditions. The flood's purpose, in this telling, is resetting conditions that had become untenable at the very place where divine-human interaction began. Consider the archaeological sequence alongside this textual tradition. Eridu's earliest temples suggest planned establishment by entities with pre-existing architectural knowledge. Rapid expansion indicates successful operations and population growth. Then crisis, environmental conditions deteriorate, construction becomes irregular and experimental, residential occupation ceases. Finally, gradual abandonment even as the site retains religious importance as ancestral sacred space. If we read this sequence from the Sumerian theological perspective, where the temple houses the actual god rather than merely symbolizing divine presence, then the architectural progression documents Enki's response to deteriorating conditions. Initial establishment of permanent earthly residence. Expansion as operations succeed. Emergency modifications as environmental conditions threaten operations. Transition from residential temple to purely ritual space as actual residence becomes untenable. And ultimately, full withdrawal, leaving behind only the structure for later generations to revere without quite understanding what occurred. The instructions of Shurupak, composed around 2500 BC, may preserve institutional memory of this transition. The text presents itself as wisdom instructions from Shurupak, king of the city bearing his name, to his son Ziusudra, the same Ziusudra who survives the flood in Sumerian tradition. Among the practical advice about agriculture, social relations, and proper conduct, the text includes specific instructions about water management, building on high ground, and maintaining knowledge of essential skills against times of disruption. The oldest extant copy, from Abu Salabik, dates to approximately 2600 BC, but linguistic analysis suggests the composition is older, possibly by several centuries. If Shurupak was a pre-flood city, as tradition maintains, and if Ziusudra survived the flood, then this text preserves knowledge deliberately transmitted across the disaster boundary. The instructions repeatedly emphasize maintenance of skills and knowledge, warning against complacency. You should not cut down a garden's date palm, it advises, not for sentimental reasons, but because the palm represents long-term thinking. It takes years to mature, but provides sustenance for generations. This is not ordinary wisdom literature. It reads like disaster preparedness. Like the documentation emergency managers create for maintaining critical operations through catastrophic disruption. Like exactly the sort of instruction someone would compose if they knew environmental and social conditions were deteriorating and wanted to ensure survival skills persisted into whatever came next. Eridu's abandonment was not sudden catastrophe, it was long decline. The temples document this in architecture. The settlement's shrinking population left less debris with each century. By the time Eridu was truly abandoned around 2000 BC, it had been dying for over 1,000 years. This is not the flood's timeline. The flood, according to textual tradition, occurs suddenly, catastrophically, with divine warning to one family. Eridu's decline is gradual, managed withdrawal. What if the flood and Eridu's abandonment represent different scales of the same underlying crisis? The flood, sudden, catastrophic, as acute event. Eridu's decline, gradual, managed, as chronic condition. The Anunnaki, according to this reading, did not face a single disaster, but a deteriorating world where acute crises erupted against a background of systemic instability. Enki's temple at Eridu was called E-Abzu, House of the Abyss. The Abzu, in Sumerian cosmology, represented the subterranean freshwater ocean from which all springs and rivers emerged. Enki's dominion was specifically this realm, not surface water but the deep water beneath the earth. His temple at Eridu marked the place where that deep water was most accessible, where the boundary between surface world and subterranean ocean was thinnest. If that boundary became unstable, if the water table rose uncontrollably, if the Abzu itself was encroaching on surface territories, then Enki's temple at Eridu would be the first place to experience the effects. And Enki himself, as master of the Abzu, would be the first to recognise that these effects were not temporary fluctuation, but systemic failure. The sweet water that sustained life was becoming the threat that made life untenable. This geological threat provides practical context for the mythological pattern where Enki repeatedly acts as humanity's protector against divine hostility. Not because he loved humans more than other gods did, but because his domain, the Abzu, the foundation of the water system supporting civilization, was failing. Enki understood the scope of the crisis because he lived at its epicenter. The rising water threatening Eridu was not local environmental bad luck. It was symptom of fundamental instability in the cosmic order his administrative domain was supposed to maintain. When the divine assembly met to discuss the coming flood, Enki dissented because he possessed information others lacked. He knew the flood was not solution but symptom. Destroying humanity would not stabilize the Abzu. The water would continue rising. The boundaries would continue eroding. And if the cosmic infrastructure supporting the Anunnaki's earthly domain was failing at this fundamental level, then no amount of administrative intervention could restore stability. The only rational response was withdrawal. Evacuate personnel, preserve essential knowledge, maintain skeletal operations at more geologically stable locations, and leave behind information for whoever survived. Because the Anunnaki's departure did not mean the crisis would resolve. It meant they had concluded they could not resolve it while remaining. Eridu's ruins preserve this conclusion in architecture. The last temple, massive and impressive, sits empty, not destroyed by disaster, but abandoned by inhabitants who left deliberately, taking with them whatever was portable and valuable, sealing behind them a structure that had served its purpose and could serve no longer. The excavations revealed one final detail. In the final occupation layer of Temple 1, archaeologists found tablets, not economic records or administrative documents. Those were presumably taken or destroyed. Votive offerings, prayers, tablets left by visitors who came to the abandoned temple long after regular operations ceased, leaving messages for the god who no longer lived there. Enki, my lord, I am your servant. One damaged tablet reads, though you have departed to your distant dwelling, hear my prayer. The tablet dates to approximately 1800 BC, 1,000 years after Eridu's temple ceased functioning as active religious centre. But pilgrims still came, still left offerings and prayers, still addressed a god who once resided here but now was elsewhere. Where did he go? The tablets do not say. Distant dwelling is the standard phrase, but it provides no geography, no direction, no specific location where Enki could be reached except through prayer to his old address, messages left at a forwarding location for a god who had moved without leaving instructions for how to follow. Eridu was the first city. It was also the first abandonment. And the pattern it established, temple precinct maintained until conditions made maintenance impossible, transition from residence to ritual space, ultimate withdrawal, leaving only architecture for future generations to puzzle over, repeats across Sumerian civilization during the centuries. Surrounding the traditional date of the flood, the gods were leaving. Eridu documents the beginning of that departure, and the architectural evidence suggests they were not leaving because they chose to, but because they recognized that staying required resources and stability they could no longer command. The question becomes urgent. If beings with power to establish cities and manage civilization for thousands of years found conditions untenable, what exactly were those conditions? What made the world they had administered no longer governable from their perspective? To understand that, we must examine the timeline they left behind, the impossible chronology of the Sumerian king list, where 8 kings reigned for a combined 241,200 years before the flood. Not mythology, not primitive exaggeration, something else. A record-keeping system documenting extended crisis conditions that finally, catastrophically, culminated in the departure the architecture proves occurred. The timeline holds clues, and those clues are stranger than simple divine longevity would suggest. The Sumerian king list's impossible timeline. The World Blundell Prism sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, catalogue number AN 1923-444. It is approximately 20 centimetres tall, a baked clay prism with 4 flat sides, each covered in neat columns of cuneiform script. Herbert World Blundell acquired it in Iraq around 1922 and donated it to the museum the following year. It is the most complete surviving copy of the Sumerian king list, and it begins with a statement that has troubled scholars for over a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. The text continues in this vein, listing 8 kings across 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, who ruled for a combined 241,200 years before, as the prism states simply, the flood swept over. After this statement, the list continues with post-flood dynasties whose reign lengths, while still extraordinary by human standards, drop into decades, or at most a few centuries. The first dynasty of Kish, which the text identifies as receiving kingship after the flood, lists 23 kings with individual reigns, ranging from 1200 years down to a few decades. Subsequent dynasties show continued decline in reign lengths until, by the early dynastic the third period around 2500 BCE, the numbers align with archaeological evidence and historical plausibility. Mainstream scholarship addresses the antediluvian numbers through 2 primary interpretations. The first treats them as pure mythology, symbolic expressions of primordial antiquity where historical fact is irrelevant to the text's theological purpose. Kings who ruled before the flood are not historical individuals, but mythological archetypes representing an idealized golden age. Their extraordinary reign lengths emphasize their remoteness from normal human experience. The second interpretation acknowledges the numbers as potential historical memory, but suggests scribal error or textual corruption across centuries of copying introduced mathematical distortions. Perhaps original reign lengths were measured in months, not years, and later copyists misunderstood the units. Perhaps different number systems were combined inconsistently. Perhaps the text records dynastic periods rather than individual reigns, with multiple rulers collapsed into single legendary figures. Both interpretations founder on specific textual details. The Sumerian king list is not isolated mythology. It exists as part of a sophisticated chronographic tradition. Multiple versions survive from different cities and time periods, all showing consistent antediluvian reign lengths despite variation in post-flood sections. The text integrates seamlessly with other administrative and historical documents. It references specific cities that archaeological excavation has confirmed existed. It names deities whose cults are independently attested. It situates itself within the practical business of royal legitimation and dynastic succession. This is not the genre of text where numbers are casual. Mesopotamian scribes maintain detailed administrative records tracking grain allotments, labour days, and livestock with obsessive precision. Their mathematical sophistication produced the sexagesimal system modern civilization still uses for time and angle measurement. When these scribes recorded numbers, they recorded them with purpose and consistency. So what system makes 241,200 years before the flood a meaningful figure? Consider the mathematical structure. The 8 antediluvian rain lengths are 28,008, 36,000, 43,000, 2,800, 36,000, 21,000, 18,600, all are divisible by 3,600. In Sumerian mathematical notation, 3,600 was represented by a special symbol called R, a large unit in their base 60 system. The antediluvian rains are expressed as multiples of R, 8R, 10R, 12R, 8R, 10R, 8R, approximately 5.8R, approximately 5.2R. This is not accident. The scribe who compiled this text deliberately structured rain lengths around R units. But R was not merely mathematical notation. It also meant universe or totality, a word denoting cosmic completeness. An antediluvian king ruling for 8R was ruling for a complete cosmic cycle, not merely an arbitrary number of years. What if the Sumerian king list records not chronological years, but administrative cycles? What if R represents not 3,600 solar years, but some other measurement of duration that made sense within the system the Anunnaki actually used to track their governance periods? Ancient astronomical texts from Babylonia, copying older Sumerian traditions, reference the concept of the R-Ari, King's R, in context suggesting it measured long-term astronomical phenomena. The precession of the equinoxes completes one full cycle in approximately 25,920 years. Divided into various zodiacal or administrative periods, this cycle could be tracked in units that, to later scribes interpreting the numbers as simple years, would appear impossibly long for individual human reigns, but might represent multiple generations of stable dynastic governance under divine authority. Alternatively, consider crisis time. During extended emergencies, time perception and record-keeping shift. Normal chronological tracking breaks down. What matters is not how many days or years pass, but how many crisis cycles are endured. Military organizations maintain operational clocks marking time by mission phases rather than calendar hours. Emergency managers think in event time, where duration is measured by damage assessment cycles and resource allocation periods rather than conventional units. If the antediluvian period represented extended environmental and cosmic instability, the deteriorating conditions that ultimately forced divine withdrawal, then administrative record-keeping might shift from normal chronology to crisis cycles. Each R might represent a complete iteration of instability management, attempted recovery. 8 kings managing 67 R cycles before the final catastrophic event would mean 8 administrations attempting to maintain operations through 67 iterations of crisis management before concluding that continued operation was unsustainable. This reading transforms the impossibly long reigns into documentation of impossibly long crises. Not 8 immortal individuals living tens of thousands of years, but 8 administrative regimes managing extended emergency conditions across time frames that, translated into crisis cycles rather than solar years, accurately capture the exhausting duration of attempting to maintain civilization. Under systemic threat, the text transition after the flood becomes revealing. Post-flood reign lengths drop dramatically but remain superhuman. Early Kish dynasty kings still rule for centuries. Only gradually, across subsequent dynasties, do the numbers decline to historical plausibility. This pattern matches neither the immortal individual's interpretation, why would gods suddenly become less immortal after the flood, nor the months interpreted as years' explanation, why would the error only partially correct post-flood. But it matches a system transitioning from crisis time to normal time. After the catastrophic event the text calls the flood, conditions stabilized enough to resume normal chronological tracking. Early post-flood dynasties still show extended reigns, because recovery period conditions remained abnormal. Social disruption, population displacement, resource scarcity all extended the timeline required for each dynastic transition. But as conditions normalized, so did reign lengths. eventually aligning with the expected parameters of human royal succession. The Sumerian king list then becomes evidence not of pre-human superhuman rulers, but of a record-keeping system that accurately captured extended crisis conditions preceding catastrophic disruption. The antediluvian kings were real administrative regimes. Their extraordinary reign lengths accurately represented the exhausting duration of managing deteriorating cosmic and environmental stability, and their ultimate failure, marked by the flood, represented not divine whim, but acknowledgement that conditions had deteriorated beyond capacity for continued management. Supporting this interpretation, several antediluvian kings' names carry semantic weight. Alulim, the first king in Eridu, means something like he who completed or the finisher. Alaljar, the second, might mean he who laments. And Meluana, the third king in Bad Tabira, includes the element me, meaning the divine powers or cosmic principles that governed reality in Sumerian theology. His name suggests something like Lord whose me is established. These are not arbitrary names. They are titles or epithets describing roles or characteristics. If the king list preserves institutional memory of actual administrative periods, then these titles tell us something about what those periods entailed. The first administrator completed or established something, perhaps initial setup of operations at Eridu. The second lamented, suggesting conditions had already begun deteriorating. The third worked with me, the divine powers, perhaps attempting to repair or maintain cosmic principles that were failing. Reading down the list with this lens, the titles sketch a narrative. Early kings establish operations and attempt maintenance. Middle kings manage increasing difficulties. Late kings, the final rulers before the flood, have shorter reigns, though still expressed in our units, and names suggesting desperation. Ubar-Tutu, the last antediluvian king, ruled in Shuruppak. His name includes tutu, a word associated with incantations and magical protection. He was ruling when protection required magic rather than administration. His son, according to tradition, was Ziusudra, the flood survivor. The king whose reign required magical protection fathered the human who survived the catastrophe. This is not mythology wandering randomly. It is generational memory compressed into genealogical form. The last administrator before collapse had descendants who transmitted knowledge across the disaster boundary. The instructions of Shuruppak take on additional significance in this context. If Shuruppak was the last antediluvian city, and if Ubar-Tutu was the last king managing operations there, then instructions from Shuruppak, son of Ubar-Tutu, to his son Ziusudra represent exact transmission of crisis management knowledge from the final administration to the survivor generation. This is not wisdom literature in the general sense. It is operational continuity documentation for disaster recovery. The text's advice becomes pointed: you should not buy a donkey that brays, it will split your midriff. Not general consumer advice, but specific instruction about resource selection under stress. Don't acquire assets that consume resources announcing their presence. You should not locate a field on a road. Strategic positioning. Don't make yourself vulnerable to traffic or military movement. You should not pass judgment when you drink beer. Operational discipline. Maintain decision-making capability under any conditions. Read as disaster preparedness for someone expected to rebuild after catastrophic disruption. The instructions' specific practical focus makes perfect sense. These are not philosophical musings. They are survival protocols for preserving not just life, but civilizational capacity across a boundary where most infrastructure and knowledge would be lost. The Sumerian king list, then, is not primitive mythology struggling to articulate prehistorical time. It is sophisticated crisis documentation recording how long the antediluvian administration attempted to maintain operations before conditions became untenable. The impossibly long reigns are accurate records of impossibly long crisis management, and the transition after the flood documents return to normal operations under human kingship after the divine administration withdrew. This interpretation makes the text's opening phrase, "after kingship descended from heaven," literal rather than metaphorical. An administrative system was established by entities from elsewhere. It operated under stable conditions for an unrecorded period. Then crisis conditions emerged, tracked in our cycles across 241,200 units of crisis time. Finally, catastrophic failure forced systematic shutdown. Kingship was re-established post-flood under human management, with divine authority now distant rather than resident. The numbers are not exaggeration. They are record-keeping in a system designed to track something other than solar years. And what they tracked was duration of attempted crisis management before inevitable failure forced those managing the crisis to abandon the project and leave. The flood was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the end. The antediluvian kings' impossible reigns document the crisis duration. And the fact that Sumerian scribes preserved this numerical system across thousands of years, copying it carefully into text after text, suggests they understood it was not mythology, but history. Not primitive confusion, but sophisticated encoding of information about just how long the gods attempted to hold the system together before recognizing that continued operation required more than they could provide while remaining. If 241,200 units of crisis time elapsed before catastrophic failure, and if that crisis manifested as environmental instability, social disruption, and cosmic boundary erosion, then the Anunnaki's departure makes practical sense. They were not fleeing on impulse. They were executing planned withdrawal after exhausting all alternatives across a time period that, however we translate the numbers, was extraordinarily long. The timeline documents endurance, not cowardice. It records persistence in the face of deteriorating conditions until persistence itself became untenable. And then it records transition from divine administration to human administration, from crisis time to recovery time, from the antediluvian world to the world the flood left behind. That world required different knowledge specifically tailored for survival and recovery without divine administrative support. And the texts preserve exactly such knowledge in a document that, like the King List itself, has been dismissed as primitive wisdom literature when it might actually be sophisticated disaster preparedness. The instructions of Shurupak deserve closer examination, not as quaint ancient proverbs, but as operational manual for the world after the gods left. Instructions from a condemned world. The tablet known as MS 2D788 in the Shine collection measures 6.8 by 7.2 centimeters. Clay, baked, covered in miniature cuneiform script, packed densely across both sides and the left edge. The colophon identifies it as instructions of Shurupak's son of Ubartutu to his son Ziusudra. The tablet dates to approximately 2400 BCE, but linguistic analysis indicates the composition is older. How much older remains contested, but several scholars place the original composition in the early 3rd millennium or possibly late 4th millennium BC, placing it very close to the traditional flood timeline. Multiple copies of this text survive from various Mesopotamian cities, suggesting it circulated widely and was valued across the region. The Abu Salabik tablet, housed at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, represents the oldest substantial copy, dated to roughly 2600 BCE. Fragments from Nippur, and Sippur confirm continued transmission across centuries. This is not obscure wisdom. This was core curriculum. The text presents itself as a father's advice to his son. 350 lines of practical instruction covering agriculture, trade, family relations, property management, social conduct, and personal character. Conventional scholarship treats it as early ethical literature, the Mesopotamian equivalent of proverbs or Egyptian instruction texts, advice for living well and successfully in Sumerian society. But examine what this text actually instructs. My son, I will instruct you, receive my instructions. Ziusudra, I will speak words to you, pay attention to them. Do not neglect my instructions. Do not transgress the words I speak. The instructions of an old man are precious. You should comply with them. Standard opening for wisdom literature. Establish authority, command attention, assert value of what follows. But then immediately, you should not buy a donkey that brays. It will split your midriff. You should not locate a field on a road. Why does wisdom literature, supposedly offering timeless ethical principles, begin with specific economic advice about livestock selection and field placement? Unless the purpose is not timeless ethics, but practical survival under specific threatening conditions where resource selection and strategic positioning matter urgently. Continue through the text. You should not make a well in your field. People will cause damage on it. You should not vouch for someone. That man will have a hold on you. You should not travel during the night. It can hide both good and ill. These are not platitudes. They are operational security protocols. Don't create permanent infrastructure that makes you vulnerable to sabotage or resource claims by others. Don't create social obligations that compromise your independence during crisis. Limit exposure to danger during low visibility periods. Agricultural advice pervades the text, but with specificity suggesting more than general farming knowledge. You should not plough a field at a road. You should not boast in the beer house like a deceitful man. You should not vouch for anyone. If you do, you will have to stand in his place. The text repeatedly emphasizes land positioning away from roads and avoidance of social obligations that might force you to assume others' burdens. This is advice for maintaining operational capacity during social breakdown. When infrastructure is unreliable, when mutual aid networks become resource drains rather than mutual support, when travel is dangerous and strangers are threats, these instructions provide framework for protecting household sustainability against destabilizing pressures. You should not bring a field labourer in from the street and put him with your own hands to work. He will not work properly. He will only consume the good things which you have prepared. You should not select a field and cultivate it in the same year as a field of your neighbour. You should not split a tree trunk together with a carpenter. You cannot each take half. Social cooperation is carefully bounded. Don't integrate unknown workers into operations. Their loyalty is unproven and they drain resources. Don't link agricultural operations with neighbours. Independence is more valuable than efficiency gains through cooperation. Don't enter partnerships over resources. Ownership disputes will arise and cooperation will fail. Compare this to the social model Sumerian texts typically advocate. Temple communities organised through collective labour, gods and humans in patron-client relationships, city-states bound through shared cult practice. The instructions of Shurupak reject this integrated model entirely. They advocate household-level self-sufficiency and careful limitation of external entanglements. Why would wisdom literature composed in the heart of Sumerian civilization recommend rejecting the social structures that made Sumerian civilization function, unless it was composed for conditions where those structures would no longer function? For a recipient expected to navigate a world without divine patrons maintaining temple-centered economies, for someone who would need to sustain household operations independently because larger support networks would be unavailable. The text's advice about interpersonal conduct reinforces this reading. You should not speak arrogantly to your mother. That causes hatred for you. You should not speak inappropriately. Later, it will lay a trap for you. You should not pass judgment when you drink beer. The heart of the drunken man is not reliable. Family cohesion is essential. Maintain respect for authority figures who hold institutional knowledge. Control communication, because words have consequences you cannot predict. Maintain decision-making discipline under any conditions, because there will be no external authority to correct mistakes. Then, embedded in practical advice, appear lines that seem to describe environmental conditions rather than offering social guidance. You should not speak improperly to your mother, her soft words will be your lot. You should not abuse a slave girl when she is in the household, her cry will be your concern. Fate is a wet bank, it can make one slip. That last line, fate is a wet bank, it can make one slip, uses the Sumerian word nam-tar, fate or destiny, but describes it through metaphor of unstable riverbank. Fate itself has become unreliable. The cosmic order that should provide stable foundation for life has become treacherous, liable to collapse without warning. Sumerian theology understood Namtar as substance decreed by the Anunnaki, binding reality to divine will. For fate itself to be unstable suggests the decreeing authority's control is weakened. The bank is wet, saturated, eroding, unable to support weight. This is not standard wisdom literature metaphor. This is description of systemic failure. The text includes specific guidance about preserving knowledge. The instructions of an old man are pressures. You should comply with them. You should not instruct a younger generation in bad conduct. And repeatedly, you should not neglect my instructions. Do not transgress the words I speak. The emphasis on intergenerational transmission goes beyond normal respect for parental authority. This is insistence that specific knowledge must survive into the next generation, regardless of whether that generation initially understands why. Near the text's end, after hundreds of lines of practical instruction, appears a passage scholars have struggled to interpret because it seems disconnected from the preceding content. In the debris of the city, the pigeon's moan, by the debris of the city walls, the sparrow's nest. The city that is destroyed cannot be rebuilt. The wall that is demolished cannot be restored. Why does wisdom literature, supposedly offering timeless advice for successful living, contain lines describing destroyed cities that cannot be rebuilt? Unless the text is preparing its recipient for exactly that reality, for a world where the urban infrastructure and divine administration that made civilization possible are gone and will not return, where success means survival and rebuilding, not maintaining existing prosperity. The text concludes with formal closure invoking the goddess Nisaba, patron of writing and record keeping, who is praised for completing the great tablets. This is not merely conventional piety, it is explicit acknowledgement that what has been recorded matters cosmically. The instructions are great tablets, documentation of essential significance, preserved by divine authority specifically concerned with maintaining records. If Shurupuk son of Ubar-Tutu composed this text, and if Ziusudra son of Shurupuk survived the flood, then these instructions represent exact knowledge transmission across the disaster boundary. The last antediluvian king preparing his heir for the world that would exist after catastrophic disruption of everything the antediluvian world had built. The text is not mythology, it is continuity planning, crisis management knowledge packaged as wisdom literature to ensure transmission across generations who might not understand context but would preserve content because it was framed as ancestral instruction. Every culture has such texts, knowledge preserved through formulaic repetition even when original purpose is forgotten. Agricultural calendars encoded in religious festivals, navigational information embedded in mythology, herbal medicine transmitted through ritual. The form ensures preservation, the formula ensures accuracy, the cultural weight ensures transmission. The instructions of Shuruppak employ this mechanism deliberately. Practical survival knowledge is dressed as paternal wisdom, given cosmic authorization through invocation of record-keeping deities and formatted for memorization and copying. The text has successfully transmitted across 4,000 years precisely because it followed these principles. But why would such transmission be necessary unless the composer expected catastrophic loss of existing knowledge systems, unless he expected social infrastructure to collapse, taking with it the temple archives and scribal schools that normally preserved and transmitted information, unless he knew his son would need to rebuild without access to the administrative apparatus that had supported Sumerian civilization for the entire antediluvian period. The text's specific instructions about household self-sufficiency, strategic resource positioning, careful limitation of social obligations, and preservation of decision-making authority make perfect sense as disaster recovery protocols. This is exactly the knowledge someone would need if they survived a catastrophe that destroyed administrative infrastructure and would need to sustain operations independently until recovery could begin. And notably, the text includes no advice about restoring contact with divine authorities, no instruction about propitiating angry gods or rebuilding temple operations. The Anunnaki are absent from this document. The recipient is being prepared to manage without them. Compare this to the Atrahasis epic, where the flood hero survives specifically because divine intervention warned and instructed him. Enki tells Atrahasis exactly how to build the survival vessel, what to bring, how to seal it, when to enter, how long to wait. The Anunnaki may be withdrawing, but at least one of them provides detailed technical guidance for surviving their departure. The instructions of Shuruppak provide different guidance, not technical instructions for surviving acute disaster, but strategic principles for navigating chronic instability and rebuilding after infrastructure collapse. These are complementary knowledge sets. Atrahasis gets survival engineering. Ziusudra gets recovery management. Together they provide complete disaster response framework, survive the event, then rebuild effectively without expecting external support. This knowledge transfer explains how post-flood civilization recovered at all. The texts explicitly state that the flood destroyed everything, cities swept away, humanity nearly exterminated, divine administration withdrawn. Yet within generations, according to the Sumerian king list, new dynasties emerge, cities rebuild, kingship continues. Archaeological evidence confirms that Mesopotamian civilization experiences disruption but not extinction during the early 3rd millennium BC. How? Because specific individuals possess specific knowledge enabling recovery, because disaster preparedness had been implemented, because the departing administration, or at least elements within it, had concluded that complete abandonment without preparation was unacceptable and had taken steps to ensure survival and recovery capacity existed even if they themselves would not remain to guide the process. The instructions of Shuruppak document one component of this preparation: technical knowledge, agriculture, resource management, social organisation, practical skills encoded for transmission to survivors who would need to rebuild without divine administrative support. But this raises urgent questions. If some Anunnaki, specifically Enki, violated consensus to warn survivors and provide recovery knowledge, what did that consensus actually decree? What were the majority of the divine assembly planning that made Enki's intervention necessary and controversial? The answer lies in the Atrahasis epic itself, in the assembly debates that preceded the flood, in the explicit textual documentation of divine decision-making regarding humanity's fate. And those debates reveal something darker than simple abandonment. They reveal a decision to allow total collapse, to let the crisis run its course without intervention, to withdraw and let the world they could no longer maintain simply cease operations entirely. Enki's dissent opposed this decision. His warning to Atrahasis, his instructions to Ziusudra through Shuruppak, his provision of survival knowledge, all of this violated the assembly's consensus. And the consistency across multiple textual traditions recording this violation suggests it was remembered as significant transgression, as the decision that determined whether post-flood recovery was even possible. To understand what the Anunnaki were fleeing, we must understand what the assembly decreed, and to understand that, we must examine the Atrahasis epic in detail, not as mythology but as meeting minutes, as preserved documentation of the actual decision-making process through which beings with cosmic authority concluded that the world they administered was no longer sustainable and chose withdrawal as their response. The assembly debates document why the gods left, and those debates reveal they were not unified in that departure, that the crisis forcing their withdrawal was contested, the response debated, and the outcome determined by majority decision over minority dissent. The tablets preserve the debate, and the debate is more chilling than simple divine cruelty. It is administrative triage, and like all triage, it required deciding who survives and who is abandoned to fate. The assembly's catastrophic decision. The Atrahasis epic survives in multiple fragmentary copies across various Mesopotamian sites and time periods. The most substantial version, known as the Old Babylonian Atrahasis, dates to approximately 1700 BC and is housed in the British Museum. The text is incomplete, significant portions are damaged or missing, but enough survives to reconstruct the narrative's essential framework. And that framework documents, with unsettling clarity, the divine assembly's deliberations before catastrophe. The epic begins not with human sin, but with divine labour dispute. In primordial times, the text explains the Igigi, lesser gods, performed the excavation work, maintaining cosmic infrastructure. They dug rivers, cleared channels, maintained boundaries between realms. The work was exhausting, the conditions harsh. After 40 years, the text specifies the Igigi rebelled. They burned their tools, marched to Enlil's dwelling, and demanded relief. The great gods convened in emergency assembly. Anu, Enlil, and Enki, the executive council, debated response. Enlil proposed crushing the rebellion militarily. Anu argued for negotiation. Enki suggested alternative solution, create a replacement workforce. The assembly accepted Enki's proposal and authorized him to manufacture humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, specifically Weila, identified as the god who had intelligence. This creation sequence establishes critical context. Humans were engineered as infrastructure maintenance labour. Their purpose was operational, not companionship or worship. They existed to perform work the Igigi refused to continue, and the Divine Assembly created them through pragmatic problem-solving, not sacred mystery. The text describes humanity's successful proliferation. Humans multiplied, spread across the land, maintained the irrigation networks and agricultural systems supporting civilization. Operations stabilized. The Igigi's workload was successfully transferred. From the divine perspective, the solution worked. But then conditions changed. The text language here is specific. The land extended. The people multiplied. The land bellowed like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their clamour and said to the great gods, "The clamour of mankind has become burdensome. Because of their uproar I cannot sleep." Conventional interpretation reads this as simple divine irritation at human noise. Humanity became too numerous and too loud, disturbing the gods' rest, provoking retaliatory disaster. But the text language suggests something more complex. The land bellowed like a bull. This is not acoustic description, but geological metaphor. The land itself was producing sound, roaring with seismic or hydrological instability. The people multiplied, but their multiplication is linked to the land's disturbance. Population pressure and environmental breakdown are connected, not separate issues. Enlil's complaint is not merely about noise, but about his inability to sleep, inability to rest, inability to maintain stable operation. The disturbance prevents normal functioning, and Enlil, as executive authority managing surface operations, is first to experience operational breakdown because his domain is the atmosphere, the surface, the realm where human civilization operates. The Assembly's response is documented across several tablets with varying levels of completeness. First, they send plague. Human population declines, clamour reduces, operations partially stabilise, but the underlying problem persists, and the clamour returns. The Assembly sends drought. Again, temporary reduction, followed by return to disturbed conditions. The text cycles through multiple divine interventions, famine, pestilence, agricultural failure, all attempting to reduce population pressure and restore stability. None work permanently. Each time the text indicates humanity recovers. Enki provides guidance enabling survival. He instructs humans in prayer to specific gods, in offerings that compel divine favour, in techniques for maintaining subsistence under adverse conditions. He is actively undermining the Assembly's population reduction efforts, though the text presents this through indirect language that technically preserves Enki's deniability. Finally, the Assembly meets to address what they now recognise as systemic failure. The text's account of this meeting, preserved on Tablet 2 of the Old Babylonian version, is fragmentary but revealing. Enlil addresses the council, "The clamour of mankind has become burdensome to me. I am losing sleep because of their uproar. Command that there be plague to diminish the noise. Let disease, sickness, plague and pestilence blow upon them like a tornado." The language is administrative. Command indicates executive decision. The goal is explicit, diminish the noise, which we now understand as reducing the systemic strain threatening operations. But the method, like a tornado, suggests violence beyond precise control. This is not surgical population management. This is letting destructive force loose. The Assembly debates. The tablet here is badly damaged, but surviving fragments preserve phrases indicating dissent. Someone, the text does not specify who, but later context suggests Enki, argues against this approach. The phrase innocent with guilty appears, suggesting argument about collective punishment. The phrase covenant broken indicates concern about obligations to humanity. Then the text preserves Enlil's response. By the clay image of ourselves we created them. Let it be destroyed. I will bring about a flood. Let it sweep over the cities. This is the decision. Not plague or famine or targeted intervention, but total destruction. The flood will sweep over the cities, eliminating the infrastructure of human civilization entirely. And the rationale is revealing. By the clay image of ourselves, we created them. Humans are identified as the Anunnaki's creation, their responsibility, and therefore subject to disposal at divine discretion when they become problematic. But the phrase clay image of ourselves contains another layer. Humans are imago Dei, made in divine image, possessing some element of divine nature, the intelligence from the god Wheeler's blood. Destroying humans is destroying something that contains divine essence. This is not simply pest control. This is acknowledging that the solution previously implemented has itself become a problem requiring elimination. The Assembly approves. The text indicates this through formulaic language. The great gods assented to this. The gods agreed to this. Consensus achieved. Flood authorized. Operations to be terminated rather than maintained under deteriorating conditions. Then the text shifts to Enki. The tablet is damaged, but critical sequence survives. Enki is bound by oath not to warn humans directly. The Assembly has required all members to swear they will not interfere with the coming destruction. Enki complies. He takes the oath. But then he travels to Shurupuk, where Atrahasis lives, and speaks to the reed wall of the man's house. Reed wall, 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 reed wall, hear, wall, understand. Man of Shurupuk, son of Ubar-Tutu, tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save life, despise property, keep the living being alive. Bring up the seed of all living creatures into the boat. The text documents Enki's method explicitly. He does not speak to Atrahasis. He speaks at the wall. Technically, he honours his oath. He has not directly warned a human, but he has ensured the warning is delivered. The technicality preserves the letter of divine law while violating its spirit. This is bureaucratic sabotage, deliberate circumvention of assembly directive by entity who cannot openly defy but refuses to comply. Why? The text provides Enki's rationale through his later words to the assembly when they discover his intervention. I did not disclose the secret of the great gods. I allowed Atrahasis to see a dream, and thus he understood the secret of the gods, a dream. Enki's defence is that he provided no direct information. The humans simply had a dream, perhaps divinely inspired, but dreams are beyond Enki's control, are they not? The defence is transparent fabrication, and the assembly recognises this, but Enki's status as executive council member protects him from consequences. He is reprimanded, but not punished. And importantly, the assembly does not reverse the decision or prevent Atrahasis from building his survival vessel. This suggests two possibilities. Either the assembly lacks power to stop Enki once he has acted, or they quietly accept his intervention while maintaining public posture of united consensus. Either interpretation indicates fractured unity within divine administration. The decision to allow total collapse was not unanimous. The dissent was suppressed procedurally, but could not be eliminated entirely. Atrahasis follows the instructions. He builds the boat, loads it with family, artisans, animals, supplies. The text specifies he brings craftspeople, people with specialised skills necessary for rebuilding civilization. Not just genetic diversity, but knowledge diversity. Someone, either Enki's explicit instruction or Atrahasis' own understanding, recognised that survival required preserving not just life, but capacity for technological recovery. Then the flood comes. The text's description is geological, not merely meteorological. Anzu tore at the sky with his talons. The land was shattered like a pot. For one day the storm blew, gathering speed as it blew. It poured over the people like a battle. Brother could not see brother. People could not be recognized in the catastrophe. Anzu is the storm bird of Mesopotamian mythology, a creature associated with thunder and destructive wind. His presence suggests atmospheric disruption beyond normal weather. The land was shattered like a pot, ceramic metaphor for geological fracture. This is not heavy rain. This is Earth's surface breaking apart. The gods were frightened by the deluge and went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouched outside. Ishtar screamed like a woman in labour. The olden days have turned to clay because I commanded evil in the assembly of the gods. How could I command evil in the assembly of the gods, ordering battle to destroy my people? For it is I who give birth to my people. The gods flee to the heaven of Anu, some location distinct from the earthly realm where they normally operate. They retreat as the catastrophe unfolds, and crucially, they are frightened. These beings with power to decree fate and create species are terrified by what is occurring. They are not controlling this event, they are escaping it. Ishtar's lament is documented as direct speech, indicating its significance. She identifies herself as having commanded evil in the assembly. She voted for the flood. But now, seeing its effects, she regrets this decision. Her people are being destroyed, and she recognises her complicity. The assembly's consensus was achieved, but it was not wholehearted. Members who agreed now wish they had not. The text continues with divine reaction. As the flood progresses, the gods, humbled, sat weeping. Their lips were closed and covered with scab. For 6 days and 7 nights the wind, the storm, and the deluge blew. When the 7th day arrived, the storm was abating. The rains, which had battled like an army. 7 days. The catastrophe runs its course, and the gods wait. They do not stop it. They cannot stop it, or if they can, they choose not to. They approved this decision, and now they witness its execution from safe distance, cowering like dogs, according to the text's unflattering description. When the flood subsides, Atrahasis' boat grounds on a mountain. He releases birds to test for dry land. He makes offerings, and the gods, described as hungry and thirsty, gather around the sacrifice like flies. This detail is jarring. The gods fled to heaven, but in their refuge they have become desperate, gathering around human offerings with the urgency of scavengers. Enlil arrives and sees the boat. He is enraged that humans survived. No man was to survive the catastrophe, he declares. The assembly's decision was total elimination, and someone has subverted this. Investigation quickly identifies Enki. Confrontation follows. Enki deflects with the dream explanation. Enlil, unable or unwilling to pursue the matter further, accepts this and redirects his attention to Atrahasis. The text resolution is critically important. Enlil does not simply allow human survival. He redesigns human existence to prevent recurrence of the problem that triggered the flood. He decrees that women will sometimes miscarry, that some women will be barren, that mortality will limit human lifespan. Population control mechanisms are installed biologically. The problem of human multiplication leading to unsustainable population pressure is addressed through designed limitations. This is not mythology, this is systems engineering. Population parameters are adjusted to prevent exceeding environmental carrying capacity. The solution previously attempted, creation of labour force without built-in limitations, nearly caused total collapse. The revised solution incorporates failure-safe mechanisms. But the text's final tablets also document something else: the gods' withdrawal from direct administration. Post-flood humanity operates under human kingship with divine oversight, but not divine presence. The patron deity system continues theologically, but the intimate administrative model documented in early dynastic temple archives does not resume. The gods have departed to their distant dwelling, with only ritual connection maintained. The Atrahasis epic, then, documents not divine cruelty, but crisis management failure. Administrative entity faces systemic overload, attempts incremental interventions. Incremental interventions fail. Entity concludes only total reset will restore stability. Entity authorises catastrophic shutdown despite internal dissent. Minority faction subverts decision enough to preserve minimal continuity. Catastrophe occurs, terrifying even those who authorised it. Survivors rebuild under revised parameters incorporating lessons learned. Administrative entity does not resume direct presence, but maintains distant oversight. This is not the pattern of gods playing with human toys. This is the pattern of administrators recognising their system has failed catastrophically, authorising emergency measures they find horrifying even as they implement them, and ultimately withdrawing from direct management because they no longer possess confidence in their ability to maintain stability. The Assembly's catastrophic decision reveals what the Anunnaki were fleeing: their own failure. The recognition that their administration had created conditions they could not control, that their solution to one problem, human labour force, had generated a new problem, unsustainable population and environmental pressure that exceeded their capacity to manage through available methods. They were fleeing the consequences of decisions they themselves made, fleeing a world that their own interventions had destabilised beyond their ability to repair, and fleeing, ultimately, the responsibility of continuing to administer a system whose failure was now undeniable. Enki's descent matters because it represents the alternative. Instead of fleeing entirely, he chose to leave warning, to preserve knowledge, to ensure some continuity across the disaster. His violation of assembly consensus was not emotional rebellion, but strategic assessment that complete abandonment guaranteed permanent loss of everything built across the antediluvian period. The instructions of Shuruppak flow from Enki's position. If total abandonment is unacceptable, then survivors require preparation. The assembly may have decided to let the world collapse, but Enki decided that collapse did not require extinction. His intervention ensured that when conditions eventually stabilized, and they would stabilize, with or without divine management, humans with capacity to rebuild would survive. The question remains, what exactly was collapsing? What environmental or cosmic conditions had deteriorated so severely that beings with power to create species and move mountains concluded those conditions exceeded their capacity to manage? What was actually happening beneath the floodwaters and assembly debates? To answer that, we must examine Enki's specific domain. His responsibility within Anunnaki administration was the Abzu, the subterranean waters. His temple at Eridu sat at the boundary between surface and depth, and if his understanding of the crisis was more complete than his colleagues, it was because his domain was the one actively failing. The sweet waters were becoming bitter, the foundations were eroding, and Enki, better than anyone, understood that surface phenomena, flood, famine, human population pressure were symptoms of something deeper that no amount of administrative intervention could fix without addressing root causes the Anunnaki apparently could not reach. Enki's disobedience was not defiance of authority. It was refusal to abandon operational continuity when abandonment guaranteed permanent loss. And that refusal provides thread to follow deeper into understanding what the crisis actually was, and why departure, despite its costs, became the only viable administrative response. Continuation of script, Enki's disobedience, and the warning protocol. In the British Museum, among thousands of cuneiform tablets from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, sits tablet K3375, the 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Baked clay, approximately 15 by 13 centimetres, damaged along its edges, but substantially intact. This is the flood tablet discovered by George Smith in 1872, and it preserves yet another version of the warning sequence. Here the flood survivor is called Utnapishtim, and his divine patron is Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki. The tablet's account adds details missing from Atrahasis. Utnapishtim describes how Ea came to him. Ea opened his mouth and spoke to me, his servant. You therefore, Utnapishtim, pay heed to my advice, that you may live forever. Abandon wealth and seek living beings. Spurn possessions and keep alive living beings. 3 separate textual traditions: Eridu Genesis with Ziusudra, Atrahasis Epic with Atrahasis, Gilgamesh with Utnapishtim, preserve the same pattern. Enki warns a human. The warning violates divine assembly consensus. The method employs technical loopholes to avoid direct oath-breaking. The instruction emphasizes preserving life over possessions. And critically, all 3 versions specify that Enki's warning included technical specifications for the survival vessel. The Gilgamesh account is most detailed here. Equal shall be her dimensions. Her width and length shall correspond. Roof her over like the Apsu. The vessel is to be built as a perfect cube, its proportions matching those of the cosmic Apsu, Enki's own domain. This is not arbitrary ship design. This is recreating, in miniature, the geometric structure of the realm Enki administers. The survival vessel is a portable Abzu, designed to maintain internal stability regardless of external conditions. Why would Enki design the vessel this way unless he understood the catastrophe as specifically disrupting the boundary between his domain and the surface? The Apsu was supposed to remain beneath. The sweet waters were supposed to support civilization from below, not inundate from above. But if that boundary was failing catastrophically, then survival required recreating stable Abzu conditions independent of the larger system's collapse. The tablet continues with detailed instructions. Let her dimensions be measured off. Into the midst of her put her structure. Utnapishtim builds using precise measurements. sealing the vessel with bitumen, loading it with provisions, family, craftspeople, and animals. The text emphasizes the vessel's sealing. I smeared her outer surface with bitumen. I smeared her inner surface with bitumen, creating waterproof barrier that isolates interior from exterior completely. This is environmental containment engineering. The vessel is not merely waterproof boat, but isolated system capable of maintaining livable conditions independent of catastrophic external environment. Enki is providing survival technology based on his understanding of what is about to occur and what conditions survivors will face. Across all three textual traditions, Enki's warning includes temporal precision. He specifies when the disaster will strike, giving the recipient sufficient time to complete construction and provisioning. The Atrahasis version preserves the phrase, "When Shamash decrees, in the evening I will cause it to rain bread cakes and wheat, enter the boat and close the door." A specific sign, unusual evening precipitation, will signal immediate danger. This precision suggests Enki possessed knowledge of the catastrophe's timeline that the assembly either did not share or did not possess. If the flood was purely divine punishment, any timing would work. But if it was geological or cosmic event following predictable progression, then timing would matter critically. Enki knew when conditions would reach critical threshold because he was monitoring those conditions in his administrative capacity. The texts preserve another crucial detail. Enki instructed the flood heroes to tell their communities they were building the vessel because Enki was angry with them and they needed to flee. Utnapishtim specifically describes how he explained his construction project to fellow citizens. "I shall go down to the Apsu to dwell with my Lord Ea. Upon you he will rain down abundance." A cover story. The truth, catastrophic flood coming, would cause panic. The lie, divine favour bringing abundance, kept the community cooperative while the vessel was built. This is operational security. Enki understood that warning one family was feasible, but warning entire populations would trigger social collapse before the physical disaster even struck. The compromise preserved just enough: genetic diversity, knowledge carriers, technological capacity, without destabilizing what little time remained before crisis point. But why specifically these individuals? Across the three traditions, the flood heroes share characteristics. They are described as righteous, yes, but also specifically as skilled administrators or craftspeople. Atrahasis is exceedingly wise. Ziusudra is son of the last antediluvian king. Utnapishtim is a successful merchant and builder. These are not random selections. These are individuals with specific capacity for post-disaster reconstruction. Enki's selection criteria prioritized recovery capability. Righteousness mattered less than competence. The survivors needed not just moral quality, but practical skills for rebuilding civilization from minimal resources. They needed to understand construction, agriculture, social organization, knowledge preservation. They needed to be essentially civilizational seed banks, carriers not just of human genetics, but of human knowledge and capability. The texts indicate Enki provided more than survival instructions. The Eridu Genesis fragments suggest ongoing communication. The instructions of Shurupak demonstrate detailed practical knowledge transfer. The later traditions about antediluvian wisdom, texts like the Sumerian king list presenting pre-flood kings as sources of essential knowledge, all point towards systematic preparation rather than last-minute warning. Enki's disobedience, then, was not impulsive. It was planned component of crisis management he understood better than his colleagues, because his administrative domain was the one actively failing. When the assembly decided to abandon operations entirely, Enki recognized this guaranteed permanent loss of everything built across the antediluvian period. His dissent was not emotional, but strategic. If we cannot prevent the collapse, we can at least ensure recovery capacity survives it. The assembly's response to Enki's violation is telling. They reprimanded but did not punish. They accepted his technical defence, "I only let him dream," despite its obvious falsity. Either they lacked power to enforce consequences against executive council member, or they quietly accepted his intervention while maintaining official disapproval. Both possibilities indicate administrative structure under severe stress, unable to maintain unity or enforce decisions effectively. After the flood, the texts show Enki negotiating on behalf of survivors. When Enlil rages at humanity's survival, Enki deflects blame and proposes the revised human design with built-in population limits. He successfully shifts the conversation from punishment to policy revision. This is skilled crisis negotiation: acknowledge the problem, propose structural solution, move forward without dwelling on past violations. The result is what scholars call the post-flood dispensation. Humanity continues, but under modified parameters. Divine administration continues, but from distance rather than direct presence. The world does not return to antediluvian conditions, but adapts to new reality where direct Anunnaki governance is no longer operational. Enki's domain-specific knowledge gave him both the earliest warning and the clearest understanding of what was failing. The Abzu, the subterranean waters he administered, was not merely flooding, it was breaching boundaries that were supposed to remain stable. The sweet water that sustained life was mixing with salt water, becoming bitter, unusable. The foundations of civilization were literally eroding. This suggests the catastrophe was not punishment, but geological failure, not divine rage, but cosmic boundary dissolution. The texts describe the flood's onset with phrases like "the land shattered like a pot" and "the fountains of the great deep burst open." These are not meteorological descriptions. These are descriptions of Earth's structure failing, of underground water reservoirs breaking containment, of barriers between realms collapsing. Enki understood this because monitoring and maintaining those barriers was his responsibility. When the assembly met to discuss the human noise problem, Enki knew that noise was symptom, not cause. The real issue was systemic infrastructure failure, that human population pressure had accelerated but not originated. Reducing human population might slow the deterioration but would not reverse it. The boundaries would continue failing regardless. The assembly chose to interpret the crisis through the lens available to them: human problem requiring human solution. Eliminate humans, reduce strain, restore stability. Enki knew this interpretation was wrong, but could not convince the majority. His warning to select humans was fallback position when primary argument failed. If we cannot prevent the collapse, at least ensure someone survives it. The three textual traditions preserving this pattern independently attest to its historical weight in Mesopotamian cultural memory. This was not minor mythological detail, but central narrative. The moment when divine unity fractured, when administrative consensus failed, when survival required disobedience of cosmic authority. The story was preserved and recopied for thousands of years because it captured something essential about the transition from the antediluvian world to the world that came after. That transition was not smooth restart. It was traumatic rupture. The texts documenting divine abandonment of cities, the lament genre, preserve the emotional and social cost of what occurred when the gods left their earthly estates and humans were left to manage without them. The laments, documentation of abandonment. The Yale Babylonian collection houses multiple tablets from the Lament for Ur, a composition describing that city's destruction around 2000 BCE. The text follows formal pattern. The patron goddess Ningal pleads with the divine assembly to spare her city. The assembly refuses. Ningal performs ritual departure, abandoning Ur before disaster strikes. Then, and only then, destruction comes. Ur, mother city, your name has become alien. Oh, bitter is the treachery that you have suffered. The storm ever breaking over you, you have become foreign in your own place. The lament is formulaic, but the formula preserves procedural sequence. Divine abandonment precedes destruction. The goddess does not flee during disaster, she leaves beforehand, following protocol, carrying out formal departure ceremony. This is not panicked escape, this is administrative withdrawal. The text describes Ninghal's attempts to prevent abandonment. I prostrated myself, I extended my arms, I shed tears. My tears, like sweet drink, I poured out before An. My supplication I presented before Enlil. She petitions the highest authorities. They deny her request. Was indeed given over to tears. My city was indeed given over to destruction. Multiple city laments survive for Eridu, Nippur, Uruk, Lagash. Each follows identical structure. Patron deity pleads for city. Assembly refuses. Deity departs with formal ceremony. City is destroyed. The consistency suggests not independent literary invention, but documentation of repeated pattern, not mythology, but historical memory of how the transition actually unfolded. Consider the administrative logic. If the Anunnaki had decided to withdraw because they recognized they could no longer maintain operational stability, then systematic evacuation would be necessary. Each city-state housed a divine estate, the temple complex with administrative staff, ritual specialists, dependent populations. Closing these estates would require formal procedures, transferring authority, documenting the change, protecting divine property that could be salvaged, abandoning what could not. The laments preserve this procedural sequence while clothing it in theological language. The goddess pleads with the assembly. She requests authorization for withdrawal. The assembly decrees her city's fate. They approve cessation of operations at that location. She departs with mourning. She executes orderly evacuation following proper protocol. Then destruction comes. The city loses divine protection and succumbs to whatever threats, mental, military, social, were held in check only by divine presence. The lament for specifies that after Ninghal's departure, the storm swept over the city. Not military conquest, that comes later, after the storm. The primary destruction is described in environmental and cosmic terms. The raging storm sent down by An in his great rage, the overwhelming flood, the storm which wipes out everything, rose together with the destructive wind. This is the same language the flood narratives use, not historical military campaign, but cosmic environmental disaster. And critically, the disaster strikes after divine abandonment. The texts sequence these events deliberately, first withdrawal of divine protection, then catastrophic breakdown. Multiple laments describe the gods' destinations as vague distant dwelling or pure place, without geographic specificity. Where did Ninghal go when she left Where did Enlil go when he abandoned Nippur? The texts do not specify, only that departure was necessary and return was not expected. Temples remained as architectural shells, maintained by human priests who performed rituals for absent deities. This created new religious model, petition to distant gods rather than service to resident deities. The shift appears archaeologically in temple architecture. Earlier structures included extensive residential quarters for divine household staff. Later structures emphasized public ritual space over domestic facilities. The gods were still worshipped, but no longer housed. The lament genre appears suddenly in the historical record around 2000 BC and continues for centuries. These are not ancient myths being recopied, they are contemporary compositions documenting recent disasters. The emotional intensity suggests eyewitness experience. My tears have become water. I am its source. On its account, my city no longer exists. If the Anunnaki withdrew systematically during this period, the laments document human response. The priests maintaining temples for absent deities compose these texts as both theological explanation, the gods left because of our unworthiness, and practical documentation. These are the cities from which divine presence has departed. These are the consequences we observe. The texts reveal trauma of abandonment. The patron deity system meant each city's identity was tied to its god. When that god left, the city's cosmic purpose dissolved. Humans continued living there, but the theological foundation for the city's existence was gone. The laments express this existential crisis. O bitter is that you are not a herb, so that you could die. O bitter is that you are not water, so that you could be dried up. The desire for itself to die rather than exist as abandoned ruin reveals how completely Sumerian civilization integrated divine presence into urban identity. A city without its god was worse than destroyed city. It was purposeless space, identity void, yet civilization continued. Dynasties rose and fell, new kingdoms emerged. Mesopotamian culture persisted for thousands of years after the god's departure. This resilience proves human capacity exceeded what the Anunnaki perhaps anticipated. Their withdrawal did not cause civilizational collapse. It caused transition to different operational model where human agency replaced direct divine administration. The knowledge Enki preserved through his warning, practical skills, social organization, technological capacity enabled this transition. The instructions of Shurupak's emphasis on household self-sufficiency and independent operation proved exactly correct for navigating world without divine patron system. Humans adapted. The laments document the pain of that adaptation, but the survival of lament texts themselves proves adaptation succeeded. But the laments also preserve evidence of what the Anunnaki were fleeing. The storm that sweeps cities after divine abandonment is described in cosmic terms, not weather, but fundamental disruption. The boundaries between realms become permeable. The dead cannot stay in the underworld. Ghosts appear among the living. The sky and earth join together in ways that should not occur. This boundary dissolution theme recurs across the texts. What was separate becomes mixed. What was ordered becomes chaotic. The cosmic structure maintaining civilization's foundation erodes, and the Anunnaki, recognizing they cannot restore that structure, withdraw rather than remain helpless witnesses to its failure. Inanna's descent, testing the escape route. The British Museum tablet K162 and the Penn Museum CBS 13902 preserve portions of Inanna's descent to the netherworld. The text describes the goddess Inanna abandoning her earthly powers and descending to the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. At each of 7 gates, Inanna surrenders one symbol of authority until she enters Ereshkigal's throne room, naked and powerless. Ereshkigal kills her. 3 days later, after intervention by Enki, Inanna is revived and returns to the surface. Conventional scholarship interprets this as fertility myth, goddesses' death and resurrection symbolizing seasonal agricultural cycles. But the text structure suggests different interpretation. Reconnaissance mission to determine if the underworld remains accessible and survivable during surface realm crisis. Consider timing. If Inanna's descent was composed during the period when surface conditions were deteriorating and the Anunnaki were contemplating withdrawal, then testing whether the underworld offered viable refuge would be strategically necessary. Inanna volunteers for this reconnaissance, descends through proper channels following established protocol, experiences conditions in Ereshkigal's domain, dies from those conditions, but is successfully retrieved through Enki's intervention using specialized knowledge. The text emphasizes Inanna's preparation. Before descending, she arranges for rescue if she does not return. She instructs her minister Ninshuber, if I do not return, set up a lament for me by the ruins. Go to Nippur, to Enlil's temple. Go to to Nanna's temple. Go to Eridu, to Enki's temple. She establishes communication protocol and rescue chain. This is not impulsive journey. This is planned operation with contingencies. Inanna expects danger and arranges backup. When she does die in the underworld, Ninshuber follows the protocol exactly. Enlil and Nanna refuse to help. They believe Inanna got what she deserved for entering Ereshkigal's domain. Only Enki responds, creating specialized beings from dirt beneath his fingernails who can enter the underworld without being subject to its rules. Enki's intervention succeeds, but the text makes clear the underworld is not viable refuge. Conditions there kill even gods. Ereshkigal's domain operates under different laws that strip power and enforce mortality, and retrieval requires specialized knowledge Enki possesses but apparently cannot teach to others. His rescue beings are custom created for single purpose. If the Anunnaki were evaluating refuge options, Inanna's descent provides definitive answer: the underworld is not survivable long term. The boundary between surface and underworld remains traversable, but conditions on the other side are lethal even to divine beings. Withdrawal must go elsewhere, not down. The text also reveals that Ereshkigal herself is trapped. She rules the underworld but cannot leave it. When Inanna descends, Ereshkigal is in labour, giving birth in pain. The text emphasises her suffering. She is not choosing to rule the land of the dead. She is confined there, maintaining operations under conditions that are themselves a form of death. This suggests the underworld is administrative assignment no one wants, maintained by deity who drew short straw. If even the underworld's administrator suffers under its conditions, then it offers no sanctuary for refugees from surface collapse. The text's conclusion is pointed. Inanna returns, but must provide substitute to remain in her place. She designates her husband Dumuzi, who is dragged to the underworld unwillingly. A compromise is reached, where Dumuzi and his sister alternate 6 months each in Ereshkigal's realm. This rotating imprisonment becomes the mythological explanation for seasons, but it also documents that connection between surface and underworld requires permanent toll. Someone must remain below to maintain the boundary. The gates Inanna passed through are not merely symbolic, they are checkpoint system regulating realm boundaries, and those boundaries require active maintenance through assigned personnel who cannot leave their posts. The cosmic infrastructure the Anunnaki administered was not self-sustaining. It required constant staffing, and if boundary failures were causing the surface crisis, then the staff maintaining those boundaries were experiencing conditions most severely. Perhaps the withdrawal was not just surface gods fleeing storms, but entire administrative network recognizing that their distributed posts throughout cosmic structure were all becoming untenable simultaneously. Inanna's successful return proves retrieval is possible with Enki's specialized knowledge, but the price, permanent replacement in the underworld, proves the cost is too high. Better to find exit that does not require leaving someone behind, and better to document the attempt so future generations understand that this option was tested and rejected for cause. The flood as secondary event. The Gilgamesh flood tablet describes conditions just before the deluge. For 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew, the downpour, the tempest and the flood overwhelmed the land. When the 7th day arrived, the tempest, the flood, which had fought like a warrior, quieted down. 7 days. The acute phase lasted 7 days. But environmental conditions prompting divine withdrawal had been deteriorating for 241,200 years of crisis time, according to the Sumerian king list. The flood was not cause but culmination, not the disease but terminal symptom. Consider the sequence across all sources: rising groundwater at Eridu, forcing temple modifications, population pressure, creating unsustainable resource demands, boundary erosion between Abzu and surface, social instability requiring increasingly severe divine interventions, cosmic infrastructure requiring maintenance the assigned deities could no longer provide, and finally, catastrophic boundary failure manifesting as flood that even the gods fled rather than witnessing. The flood was endpoint of long systemic failure, the moment when accumulated deterioration reached critical threshold and cascaded into total collapse. The texts describe this through images of boundaries dissolving, sky meeting earth, fountains of the deep opening, the land shattering, not weather event, but structural failure of the cosmic architecture maintaining civilization. The Anunnaki recognized this threshold approaching. The assembly debates document their awareness that conditions were terminal. Their decision to withdraw rather than attempt continued operations from untenable positions was not cowardice but realism. They had spent incomprehensible time, those impossible antediluvian years, attempting to manage the crisis. Eventually they concluded management was impossible and withdrawal was only viable option. Enki's dissent was not optimism that crisis could be resolved. It was insistence that even terminal crisis does not require complete abandonment of accumulated knowledge. His warning preserved not hope that the antediluvian world could be restored, but practical capacity for building something different from the ruins. The post-flood world was not restoration, but new beginning. Human kingship without direct divine governance, cities without resident patron deities, agriculture and civilization maintained through human knowledge and effort rather than divine administrative support. The world the Anunnaki had built did not survive the flood, but the capacity to build, preserved through Enki's intervention, did survive. This is not mythology about angry gods punishing human sin. This is documentation of civilizational collapse precipitated by infrastructure failure beyond the capacity of even cosmic administrators to repair. The survivors were not righteous remnant preserved by divine favour, but strategic selection of knowledge carriers prepared with specific skills for rebuilding from minimal resources. The tablets record this clearly for those reading them as administrative documentation rather than religious myth. The Sumerian king list tracking crisis duration. The instructions of Shurupak providing recovery protocols. The Atrahasis epic documenting the assembly's decision-making. The laments describing systematic withdrawal. Inanna's descent testing alternatives. And the flood accounts describing the terminal event when accumulated failure finally cascaded into catastrophic collapse. What the Anunnaki were fleeing was not human noise. It was recognition that the world they administered had become ungovernable, that the boundaries they maintained were failing, that their continued presence would not prevent collapse, but only ensure they were present when collapse occurred. Better to withdraw while withdrawal was possible, preserve what could be preserved, and leave behind information for whoever survived, the archives they left behind. In the climate-controlled vault where this investigation began, tablet CBS 1673 documents transfer procedures. Items moved from one temple precinct to another, knowledge secured for departure, and then the word key, the gods departing, taking essential instruction with them, but leaving behind enough for those who would come after. The Sumerian tablets were not religious texts. They were administrative records, legal documents, astronomical observations, mathematical computations, medical treatises, agricultural calendars. The civilization that emerged in Mesopotamia after the gods left continued using and expanding this knowledge precisely because it was practical, not theological. Modern civilization inherited that knowledge. Mathematics, astronomy, timekeeping, agriculture, writing itself, all building on foundations the Sumerians preserved through the discontinuity of divine withdrawal and environmental catastrophe. The knowledge survived because it was recorded, because the records were preserved, because the survivors understood that records represented continuity across trauma. The question, what were the Anunnaki fleeing, has an answer grounded in the textual evidence. They were fleeing recognition of failure, fleeing a world whose cosmic infrastructure was collapsing beyond their capacity to repair, fleeing boundaries that could no longer be maintained, fleeing responsibilities they could no longer fulfill while remaining in the positions assigned to them. They documented their departure through administrative records that were preserved and recopied for thousands of years. The king list tracking their governance duration. The laments documenting their systematic abandonment of temple estates. The flood accounts describing the catastrophic event that marked transition from direct divine administration to human self-governance. The instructions they left behind providing practical knowledge for rebuilding. These tablets were not mythology created to explain natural phenomena. They were institutional memory preserved across civilizational collapse, documentation of what occurred, why it occurred, and what knowledge survivors needed to rebuild when the administrators who established civilization could no longer maintain it. The archives they left behind are the evidence. Scattered across museums in Philadelphia, London, Oxford, Baghdad, Berlin, Istanbul, Paris, clay tablets preserving the moment when beings with cosmic authority faced crisis exceeding their power to resolve and chose strategic withdrawal over futile persistence. Those tablets remain, silent in their storage boxes, waiting for questions specific enough to yield their testimony. Not did ancient aliens build civilization, but what do administrative records reveal about how established authority responds when systemic failure exceeds available solutions? The answer is documented in cuneiform, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. They withdraw. They preserve what can be preserved. They leave information for survivors. And they depart to distant dwellings whose location they do not specify, because perhaps they themselves do not know where their retreat will lead, only that staying is no longer viable. The Sumerian texts reveal the Anunnaki were escaping something bigger, not bigger than themselves necessarily, but bigger than their capacity to manage while maintaining operations in assigned positions. They faced the crisis administrators always eventually face, recognition that the system they maintain has failed systemically and no amount of crisis management will restore functionality. Their response was documented. Transfer essential knowledge. Warn selected survivors. Execute orderly withdrawal. Leave archives for whoever comes after. Then depart. Wherever you are tonight, listening to these words drift past as sleep approaches, you are part of what came after, the civilization that rebuilt when the gods left, the knowledge transmission chain extending from Sumerian scribes through centuries of copying to digital archives you access from anywhere on Earth, the continuity they attempted to preserve despite cosmic failure, despite administrative collapse, despite every reason to simply abandon the project entirely. They left archives. We inherited them, and those archives remain, testimony to the moment when even gods recognized limits and chose preservation over persistence. Sleep comes gently now, the investigation complete, the tablets bearing witness, the archives silent but speaking, for anyone asking questions specific enough to hear what administrative records actually preserve. Good night. And if this resonated somewhere in the quiet space between waking and dreams, the archive continues, the testimony remains, the tablets wait.